Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this TLC event, the Teaching and Learning Center of the Faculty of Behavioral Sciences. My name is Chip Huisman. I will be your host. I will give you a very short introduction before I will give the word to our guest speaker for today. Today, we will dive into the world of self-regulated learning, and therefore we have a special guest. His name is Peter Verkoeijen, endowed full professor at Erasmus University in educational psychology and also lecturer at Avans Hogeschool. He will give us a workshop, a masterclass, and without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Peter.
So thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me. Welcome to this masterclass. And like Chip says, it's an introduction to a theme, and you will be working a lot on this theme. So I hope this meeting will be kind of a first meeting for you to help you get inspired about self-regulated learning and think about what you can do in your own context to support self-regulated learning of your students. I guess if I've accomplished that after this session, then I did a good job. And like Chip said, I have a double affiliation, so at Erasmus University and at Avans University of Applied Sciences. I'm a researcher, and self-regulated learning is one of the themes that I focus on. It's a quite recent theme, and the interest has started a few years ago. By origin, I'm a cognitive psychologist, so I did my dissertation on the spacing effect, perhaps a familiar effect for some of you. It's one of the learning techniques, spacing, that you will see later on in this session, and which also plays a role in self-regulated learning. So I guess I got interested in self-regulated through the route of effective cognitive learning strategies. But I'm also a teacher. I guess that's also very important, especially to say here. I have a lot of experience as a teacher in academic higher education. I guess I teach more than 27 years since I started as a tutor, as it's called, at Maastricht University, where I did my master's degree, teaching small problem-based learning groups. And afterwards, I went to Rotterdam to start a new psychology program there. And at that time, that was quite innovative with problem-based learning and progress testing. And since then, I've all kinds of roles. I've been chair of the examination board, chair of the curriculum committee. So teaching is one thing that is dear to my heart, I would say, apart from doing research. And I guess it's a good thing to note here, because this is a combination of teaching and research and doing research in your own education. I'm also the project leader of Selflex, and Brigitte is one of my colleagues in that. And Selflex is a national consortium of universities of applied sciences and universities. And the people who I work with are teachers and researchers and educational professionals in broader sense. And they work on the question of how you can support self-regulated learning in higher education, in flexible higher education. And that's one of the significant questions in higher education, as you might know. Self-regulated learning is a really hot theme these days. And today what I will do, I will tell you a bit. To start, I will tell you a bit about self-regulated learning as a concept. So what is self-regulated learning? And I'm also curious to hear what you think that self-regulated learning is, but also why it would be important to try to support self-regulated learning in your students, and why it's needed, because students often don't do what you would ideally expect according to self-regulated learning framework. But most of the time, actually, you will be thinking and discussing with each other how you can support self-regulated learning in your own context. And I will start this part by asking you to reflect on your role as a teacher and on how good your self-regulated learning skills are yourselves. So that's one thing. And the other will be about thinking about how you can support it given the challenges that you see in your context. And at the end, I will also give you some examples of what you can do to support specific aspects of self-regulated learning in practice, and based on my own experience. And these tools are actually used in higher education as we speak. So that's the program for today. I will start with the introduction of self-regulated learning. And when you look at the literature, there is you have different theoretical conceptions of self-regulated learning. and the theories differ a bit in focus, but they have something in common. And what they have in common is something that you see here in this definition by Pinterich. It's a somewhat older one, but still applies, I would say, to self-regulation in general as the way it's conceptualized in the literature. And what you see here is that self-regulated learning is considered to be a cyclical process. In which a learner directs behaviors, thoughts, feelings, and motivation to achieve certain learning objectives. And that takes place in a specific context. So that's at a very general level what self-regulated learning is. You could say it's goal-directed working when you want to learn something. When you look at this in more detail, I think it's useful to go to a model that's often used in education, and it's at the basis of many interventions that you see in all types of educational levels, and that's the model by Zimmerman. And here you see this model, and you see the important elements of the model. And as you will notice, many of these elements are also elements that you mentioned from your examples. So here you see it's a kind of a cyclical process in which people start at a certain with a certain phase and end at a certain phase. And within these phases, you see all kinds of components. So the idea is that a learner begins with the planning phase or the forethought phase, as it's called in Zimmerman's model. The learner is faced with a task, which is a sub-element of a learning process. And the idea is that a learner thinks about this task and does an analysis of it and asks themselves, well, what is this task exactly? And what are the end terms? What are the quality criteria? So it's all part of the task analysis. But also, and that's more about the motivational aspect of it, they think about, and how valuable is this task to me? And task value is a concept which some of you might know from motivational theories, such as the situated expectancy value theory. And task value is composed of a number of things. So it's related to self-efficacy. Do you think you're able to do the task if you work hard on it? That's one thing. So can I do this? But also, do I want to do this task? And that question is based on how interesting a person thinks that working on a task will be. Also, how important working on this task is for the learner themselves, according to important personal value that this learner has. So it's called attainment. Of course, you have utility, so instrumental value. So if I don't do this task, what will be the consequences of not doing it, or the other way around? So that makes up the task value. And people think about that. It's the idea, at least, for adequate self-regulated learners during the planning phase. And they also set a goal. And that can vary. The goal can be, I want to learn something for mastery, or I want to learn something for performance. So, meeting some kind of quality requirement, or being better than someone else, or a mixture of that. But you think at least also about the goal. And then based on your task analysis, your idea of the task value, and the goal that you selected, you select also some kinds of strategies that you use to achieve your goal, or that you plan to use to achieve your goal. And then people move to the next phase, which is the execution phase, or the performance phase, as it's also called in Zimmerman's model. And what people then do, they use these learning strategies that they planned in the first phase to achieve their goal. And during that phase, they also check their understanding of mastery. They monitor whether they're reaching their goal. And they take control measures when that's required. For instance, you might notice that you're not paying full attention anymore to the task, and you might take measures to remedy that problem. That would be an example of monitoring and control. Once you've executed the task, you reflect or evaluate, and you think about, well, did I achieve my goal? And am I satisfied with what I've achieved? There's also definitely an affect component there. So it's kind of an emotional component. So if you did not achieve your goal, how do you feel about that? And what do you conclude from that? For example, you might have a growth mindset approach, in which you think, well, maybe I didn't do that well on this task, but I can do if I improve on certain things. Or you say, well, this is a kind of a fixed mindset approach. I simply cannot do this, so I try to avoid this task the next time. So that will be related to the "Are you satisfied?" question. And then you ask yourself, well, what could I do to improve the next time? So this is the process, kind of a summary of it at least, that's sketched by Zimmerman in this model. And this is often what you see as a conceptualization of self-regulated learning. So you could say this is more specifically what self-regulated learning is. And as you see this, it comes with many different components. And when you look at the strategies that people can employ, you can make a distinction between three types. So people use three types of strategies in this process to reach their goals. So you have cognitive strategies, and these are strategies related to processing of information. And I will show you an example of what you can do with this respect, but it's something that people select. So you might, for example, decide to space your study across time, which is a good thing. Or you might decide to cram the night before the exam, which is also a cognitive strategy, but not such a good one, at least from the perspectives of teachers. That's not a good one. From the perspective of students, it might be a good one. Maybe for their goal, if your goal is to pass an exam, maybe it might be a very effective strategy. But that's in the domain of the cognitive strategies. You also have metacognitive strategies, and they relate to the planning, monitoring, and evaluation phase. So thinking about what you are going to do, monitoring what you're doing, trying to take control measures, and reflecting on what you did and think about how you can improve. So these are the metacognitive strategies that are also important. And finally, you have a whole bunch of resource management strategies, which people typically use in the execution phase. So people, if they notice that they're, for example, that they're not entirely on track, they might do all kinds of things to get on track. For example, if you're dozing off, you might have strategies to get your attention back to where you want it to be. So that's one example of a resource management strategy. Or you might select a learning environment in which you can study for a longer time without being disturbed. That might be environmental control. Or you try to seek help if that's necessary, seek help of the appropriate people who can help you. So that's another strategy. Or motivational strategy. So motivating yourself. So maybe, for example, if you're working on statistics tasks, I'm a statistics teacher, by the way. Well, some students might conclude, well, this is not really a fun thing to do, but they might motivate themselves to get themselves going. So these are all examples of resource management strategies that people might use to make sure that they achieve their goals. So this is what you have in more detail. So the cyclical process, according to Zimmerman, and these strategies which are at the core, as you could say, of the self-regulated learning. And this is what we ask students to do in a kind of idealized or an ideal world. You would go through the Zimmerman model and use all kinds of good strategies. And there are good reasons, actually, for us as teachers to want to stimulate students to do that. And these reasons vary. For example, one of the reasons, and I like to show this, it's very small, small font, so I will read it to you. I always like this because it shows that attention to self-regulated learning is not normatively neutral. It's based on values that are also culturally grounded. So what you see here, this is from a paper by Zimmerman, paper by Zimmerman. What he writes there: since the founding of the Republic, American educational leaders have stressed the importance of individuals assuming personal responsibility and control for their own acquisition of knowledge and skill. And he gives an example of Benjamin Franklin and how he did that. But the idea is that this is a good thing, so that an individual, you should take responsibility for your own learning. But of course, you can question that. Why should an individual do that? It is related to ideals from the Enlightenment and autonomous individuals, but it's sometimes something that you also can dispute. So I guess it's good to know that maybe the importance of something like self-regulated learning has also a kind of a cultural background. In certain cultures, this is considered to be important, but there might be cultural differences. So one reason is that maybe it's related to what we in our culture, at least here in Western Europe, find important. Other reasons, and I like this one as well. So here, this is also again from Zimmerman. His interesting quotes, and I will read it for you. In the era of constant distractions in the form of portable phones, CD players, computers, and even televisions for young children, it's hardly surprising to discover that many students have not learned to self-regulate their academic studying very well. Consider the case of Tracy, a high school student who is infatuated with MTV. I guess many of us still know what MTV is, right? That was in 2002 when Zimmerman wrote that. Well, 23 years ago. And I guess the challenges that our students face have become even bigger, right? So we don't only have CD players and televisions, we have more than that. So it's an environment which makes it sometimes challenging to go through these phases of Zimmerman in a way that leads to strong learning. So this is a reason why maybe in this time it's extra important to help students to do this self-regulated learning well. And what you also often hear is that in professional fields, I also work at a University of Applied Sciences, so really vocational education. And what they say, well, the people in the field, they want students to be self-regulated learners. So it's a part of their profession. Although they don't call it self-regulated learning, it's often what they often mention is lifelong learning. But when you ask what they mean by that, then that has a lot of similarities with the Zimmerman cycle. So planning, monitoring, reflecting. So it's something that you see is maybe getting more and more important also in the professional field. So that might also be a reason why in higher education we should pay attention to supporting students in this. And also, this is true in academic education, but also in higher vocational education, and maybe even to a larger extent. So education becomes more and more flexible in the sense that students can, that there's flexibility in all kinds of dimensions, and maybe it's increasing in some of these dimensions. So how you can study, where you can study, what you can study is becoming more flexible than it was maybe some years ago. And also what you can study. For example, at Avans University of Applied Sciences, students can select a large part of their own curriculum. So that's a dimension of flexibility that has, in which there's more room for students to operate. And that also requires, it puts extra demands on student self-regulated learning and makes it extra important to support students in doing this well. And finally, what you see in the literature is that self-regulated learning, if you measure this in students, is positively and sometimes also causally related to well-being. So students who are able to regulate their learning in a good way, they feel better. And also it's related to study success and achievement. So these are all kinds of reasons why it's important to support the self-regulated learning of students. So I guess it's also good to know. So why is this important in this day? Why is there so much attention to this topic? And it's also necessary because there are all kinds of challenges or problems that I guess we as teachers see in higher education when it comes to self-regulated learning. And to give you one example, I will give you an example that's related to the cognitive learning strategies, because that's the domain I originally came from. Later on in this session, I will also show you a training that focuses specifically on training students to use these effective cognitive strategies. And before I go into that, it's important to know that effective means effective for building meaningful knowledge. So rich knowledge structures in which you connect new information to what you already know, very briefly put. And some strategies work better for that purpose than others. For example, I don't know, maybe some of you know this paper. This is a very well-known paper, at least in applied cognitive psychology by John Landowski and colleagues. They reviewed learning strategies, cognitive learning strategies that have been studied in the course of time by educational psychologists, cognitive psychologists, applied cognitive psychologists, and they looked at the practical utility of these techniques. And here you see the techniques. So you have elaborative interrogation. I will very briefly explain them. So elaborative interrogation is asking yourself why questions when you're studying materials. And it often comes with self-explanation. So if you ask yourself the why question, then the explanation typically follows. So it's often about causal mechanisms that you have to try to grasp for yourself. And that's something you do by asking why questions and trying to explain for yourself. Of course, summarization, so trying to get to the gist of something that you read. Highlighting, so it's clear, I guess, for everyone. Using a keyword mnemonic, so keywords that also cover the gist of a written text. All kinds of imagery, so mind mapping, for example, would be something that you could do when you're using imagery for text learning. Rereading, simply rereading over and over again a certain kind of chapter, for example. Practice testing is first reading something and then trying to retrieve it from memory or doing practice testing itself. Distributed practice is spacing, explained to you before, right? Spacing your study efforts over time instead of cramming. And interleave practice, that's what you often see in the more mathematical domains. So switching different problem-solving categories instead of blocking one category and then moving to the other. So, for example, blocking would be only doing a t-test and then only doing an OVA. Mixing would be mixing these two together. And these strategies have been extensively studied. And Dolowski and colleague, they labeled this according to utility, so the value for practice. And they created kind of a rank order. And you see that elaborative interrogation, self-explanation, and interleave practice, they score at moderate level. So they're moderately useful for practice, and they base that on the empirical evidence. So was it found, for example, with all kinds of different learners in different contexts, with different outcome measures. Practice testing and distributed practice score quite high on this scale, and the other ones score low. So this is what you could say what the evidence shows when it comes to the cognitive learning strategies. And in the context of self-regulated learning, if you ask students, so if you study on your own, what do you do? Then you get something like this. This is one of the first studies on this, but you have many, or also more recent papers on that. And what it shows is that people basically show they use a mix of strategies. But you also see that they often use strategies that are not very effective, at least for building meaningful knowledge. For example, many students do rereading, to engage in rereading their notes, the textbook, whereas that's not a very effective strategy. Other strategies are much more effective. They do practice problem, which is a good thing, but also rewriting notes. So I guess the core conclusion of this paper and many others is that students use a mixture of strategies, but not always the most effective ones. And that's also a reason why you should support students in this aspect of self-regulated learning. So very specifically for effective cognitive learning strategies. And there are other reasons as well. So if you look at the metacognitive strategies and the resource management strategies, then I guess both from practical experience and from the literature, it's clear that students operate suboptimally in that domain. That's a question. Yeah.
Have they linked it to the type of knowledge or the type of tasks that people...
Yeah, so the question is, have they linked it to the type of tasks? In this case, they asked, okay, if you're studying on your own, and presumably for an exam, I don't think they said that explicitly, but they say, okay, you have to study on your own. What do you do? And students wrote down things they did, and this is how they categorized this. But it's quite interesting because we recently did a study in which we asked students, okay, if you have, for example, a high stakes exam, how would you study versus when you have a low stakes exam? And you see that people make that there's a distinct difference. So for high stakes exams, students say that they will use the more elaborate and more effective strategies, which involve desirable difficulties. So they take quite some mental effort. Whereas when the exam is not as important to them, they say they use somewhat more superficial strategies, or at least that's what they say that they will do. So it's an important caveat, of course, because there's an intention behavior gap. But in this case, the question that you typically see in these kind of studies is very generic. So how would you study when you study on your own? And you typically something like this. So mixture of superficial, somewhat more superficial and deep level strategies as a mix. Yeah. And maybe you could also say, well, but this is also something that works for them, right? So you can pass your exams when you do this. It's also something that relates to how we design our education. But I wanted to show you this to show that at least there's also a need to support self-regulated learning, and this applies to these to the cognitive strategies, which is one of the 3 strategies, but it also equally applies to metacognitive strategies and resource management strategies. So the conclusion is it's important to support students. And that might also relate to kind of a misconception that I sometimes hear, and it's kind of a well-known one, that when you talk about self-regulated learning, that people think that self-regulated learning means that students have to do it on their own. But that's not the case. If you want to promote this, then you have to help them with that. So it is needed. Because students, when left to their own devices, they do not automatically do what we as a teacher would like them to do. And also, there's all kinds of research that shows that it is effective. For example, Theobald, he did a meta-analysis on interventions that have been done in higher education, and it shows that there are clear effects of these interventions on performance, on self-regulated learning itself, and on aspects of motivation. So support is something that helps. The big question of these days is also, so what should we do then to support students? And that's still also quite an open question, although I will give you some examples of what you might use at the end. But before I do that, and that's later on in the session, I want you to think about the support and what you think would be important to help them, given the problem that you see in your own educational setting. Because it's also, like I showed in the definition, the self-regulated learning depends on the context that you have, and also what you want to do to help students also depends on the challenges that you see as a teacher in the context. Before we come to that, however, I want to ask you, and this is the first exercise, I'm going to create some groups here of 4 or 5 people, in which I first want you to ask to reflect on you as a teacher, because from the literature, what emerges there is if you want to support self-regulated learning as a teacher, it's important that you yourself know what self-regulated learning is. You have knowledge of the concept yourself. That you have the skill, your own self-regulated learning skills, that these are well developed. Also that your beliefs point toward a certain direction, and also that your self-efficacy is high enough. So for the first exercise assignment, I want to ask you first to reflect on these 4 aspects of the teacher role, to take about 5 to 6 minutes for that individually, so that you think yourself about these 4 aspects. I hope you can do that in a kind of self-regulatory manner. So when it comes to supporting, for example, in the literature, you have very generic things that you can do. For example, this is from Eve Carlin's paper, and it's an acronym, it's INSPIRE. So one thing you could do is, explicitly teach certain kinds of strategies, because sometimes that really is the problem. I guess it's also mentioned here, sometimes people really do not know how to plan well, especially for complicated assignments when you work in groups together with other people. So maybe you have to be very explicit about this and teaching them. And this is also so very specifically as a navigator. So that's helping students on the metacognitive part. So goal setting, planning, overcoming obstacles. That's something that you can discuss also previously and also when they're working. So that's a navigator thing that you can do. And integrates self-regulated learning in your classes. So it's good also to talk to students about, okay, how did you prepare for this meeting? Did you prepare for this meeting? And if you don't, then what can we do next? Because if no one is prepared, then you can go ahead, but it's not really useful. Maybe you can say, well, okay, so what can we do then next? How can you make sure that you will do the assignment for the next class? And if you talk to students about that, then they are inclined, I guess, to do so. So this is one thing. Or the other thing that you can do, the authentic and relevant task. That's also something that was mentioned here. That as a promoter, that helps. and sometimes also use technology. For example, the Avans teacher I showed, he used kind of a dashboard in which students had to upload all kinds of assignments, and he could readily see how well students did and which students needed extra attention. And that dashboard helped him kind of as a technological tool to specifically help students who were struggling or didn't do anything. We talked about this a bit. Demonstrate and explain your own skills. For example, like the example of the art education. If reflection, like the students said, or the economy students, they say, well, our own teachers don't do this, so why should I? So it's good also if you think that's important for planning, monitoring, reflection. It's also good to demonstrate it. The other one that relates specifically to, and it's a challenge, I guess, these days with generative AI, is to stress the importance and the beauty, I guess, of mental effort, because learning takes time and effort, and that's and it pays off in the long run. So the immediate effect might not be visible, but it will be there in the future, and it's good to acknowledge that. And I guess I spoke to someone at the beginning here before the session started that I guess the example was that a student used the shortcut, the AI shortcut, I guess, and then said, well, okay, it maybe was appealing at first, but at the end, I didn't learn a lot. And I guess that's also something that people experience, and it's good to show them that, so that effort pays off and helps you, but it's something that you see in the long run. So these are general strategies that Carlin and Hartel mentioned. And finally, and I only take a few 2 minutes, I use for example, the study SMART training from Maastricht University is something that you can specifically use for effective cognitive strategies, and it contains multiple sessions. And the video is in here, and you can show it watch it later. This is in Dutch, but the first session starts with awareness of what effective learning is, and that learning takes effort. They practice with learning strategies, and they reflect on what they did during their self-study. We now incorporated the Study SMART training in a Thrive Track program in Rotterdam for our bachelor program. And the experiences are actually quite positive. So students appear to be more aware of what good learning is and seem to use this in their toolbox, using it also quite flexibly. And there's also research showing that the awareness increases and that the use of certain strategies, effective strategies, increases. So this is something that helps. It's a very useful training. It's unfortunately unfortunately, it's a training you have to pay for. So if you do this costs you sometimes the money to train the trainers. And I guess it's stronger if you also integrate it in your lessons. So that if you say, well, okay, what you learned in the Study SMART program, you might also learn in statistics. But it's definitely an interesting tool to consider. And finally, and then I quit, and that's related to motivation, because it's such a big issue also with respect to self-regulated learning. We developed motivatiemotor, as it's called in Dutch. It was developed as a part of an NVA impulse, a start impulse. And it's a reflection tool for teachers to think about what they do to support kind of autonomous motivation. And it's based on the self-determination theory, so it contains questions that reflect you on how you support structure and competence, basically, connectedness, and autonomy. And that helps you also to design your courses in a different way. So this is something we have quite some positive experiences with that. Teachers say it helps me to be aware of how I can make my lessons more autonomously motivating. It's quite also, if you can do it on your own as a teacher, but it works better in groups. And also if you couple it related to, or if you combine it with lesson observations. We do that at Avans University of Applied Sciences, but it's quite well. You're literally exposed as a teacher, but it's very helpful because you really see what you do and how you can improve. And that also is an important factor when it comes to self-regulated learning. So these two tools might be interesting. And also, I think we as a teacher, I would say, at least you also have to try out things in practice and see, because science in itself doesn't generate art, right? You have an intermediary, and that's the teacher that tries to see how all these things, in this case about self-regulated learning, have to get into practice. So thank you for your attention. If you have final thoughts or questions, maybe we can do that afterwards at the borrel. And thank you.
Thank you so much.